I'm just going to start off with a couple of very tiny stories because there was a very famous Jewish proverb that says, the more stories you know, the more ways you have telling the truth. That's an old Jewish proverb, right, Dan?
I heard it from an old Jew.
In fact, Dan made up that proverb, but I think it reminds me of the story of Shlomo Carlebach. Has anybody heard of Shlomo Carlebach? He's a very famous rabbi, folk singer, composer, and one day he was performing a wedding and he came late, right? And anything you know about Jewish couples are not always the most calm, and they were so frantic, and Shlomo Carlebach shows up for the wedding and says, I want you to know, there's an old Jewish tradition that says, if the wedding starts late, it's going to be a happy marriage. Oh, the husband and wife are smiling, beaming from ear to ear. Shlomo Carlebach finishes the wedding, comes sit at the table, and one of the other rabbis says, Rabbi Carlebach, beautiful wedding, but I've never heard that tradition that says when a wedding starts late, it'll be a happy couple. And he said, of course you didn't, I just made it up. So all traditions start somewhere. So Dan was telling me that he's looking forward to hearing stories because some of the stories might trigger more stories in his mind, not that he needs a trigger. And as I was driving up here, I was thinking of a couple of Dan-related stories. And I'm going to give you two very short stories before I hand the mic back over to Brian. The first story is one I actually heard from Dan himself. And it's about a young man who comes over to a rabbi and says, Rabbi, what is the meaning of life? The rabbi says, very good question, very good question. And the student says, Rabbi, thank you, but so what is the meaning of life? It's an excellent question. It's a question you can spend the rest of your life pondering. The young man says, Rabbi, thank you for the compliment again, but what is the answer? It's a wonderful question, so profound, so beautiful, so exquisite. And the young man says, Rabbi, what is the answer? And finally the rabbi gets upset. The young man looks and says, why do you want to take such a beautiful question, such a wonderful question, such an infinite question, and settle for a mere answer? Yeah. It's a beautiful story about sometimes the question is even more important than the answer. And another story has to do with questions. It's one I heard from Roman Kent, who was an incredible Holocaust survivor. I quoted him last time I was here. Do you remember the quote? He said, I've been in Auschwitz where a day seemed like a month seemed like a year, years seemed like a lifetime. All I can tell you after my experience in the Holocaust is hating is never right and loving is never wrong. Beautiful quote from Roman Kent. And this is a story I heard from Roman Kent, whose mother was best friends with Dan's mother. They both survived the Holocaust. And he tells the following story. And I think about it from time to time. During the Holocaust, in Poland, a peasant comes to the priest and says to the priest, I'm here for confession, and I've committed a terrible sin, and I want forgiveness. And the priest says, what's the sin? He says, I feel so guilty, I can't even tell you what I did. But how do you expect forgiveness? You can't tell me what you did. This goes on. Finally, he says, I'll tell you what I did. There was a Jewish family who I was close with. I'm hiding in my basement. I couldn't say no to them. I couldn't look in their eyes and turn them away. And my neighbors have told me anybody who saves a Jewish family is going to go directly to hell. And that's my sin. And the priest says, that's your sin. That's the most noble thing you could possibly do. It's very courageous, very brave. You're not going to hell. You have a direct ticket to heaven. And the peasant looks at the priest and he's a little bit puzzled. And he stumbles away from the confession. And a week later, another peasant comes to the priest and says, I'm here, but I haven't committed a sin. I just have a religious question for you. The priest says, sure. Normally it's for confession. What's the religious question? And he says, is it true that if you hide a Jewish person, you have a direct ticket to heaven? End of story. And I always found this story so profound. Had more people in Europe felt that saving a Jewish family would have given them redemption, or more religious leaders would have spoken up and taken a stand against what was going on, perhaps a lot of more Jewish lives would have been saved. So those are my introductory stories. I'm going to pass it over to Brian for some more interesting stories and comments.